Wyoming looks like open space and quiet sky until the ground gives itself away. In Yellowstone, steam rises through snow like the land is exhaling, and beneath those forests sits a vast volcanic caldera shaped by an eruption about 640,000 years ago. This isn't a single hot spring or a lone geyser. It's a whole living system, more than 10,000 hydrothermal features with boiling water and pressure finding cracks in the earth like veins. So what are people really standing on when they watch Old Faithful erupt on schedule? And what happens when beautiful is also restless? Wyoming is often described as big sky country, but that phrase barely hints at how many worlds sit inside its borders. On the surface, it can look like a calm quilt of sagebrush basins, river valleys, and high plains until the land suddenly rises into knife-edged ranges, or splits along invisible faults, or steams like a kettle left on the fire. The state holds the spine of the Rocky Mountains in the west, wide-open basins across the center, and the kind of raw, wind-carved distance that makes towns feel like islands. In the northwest corner, the Yellowstone Plateau is the place where Wyoming's quiet facade breaks first. Yellowstone's geothermal landscape is not a decorative accident. It is the surface expression of a huge volcanic system. The U.S. Geological Survey describes 3 extraordinarily large explosive eruptions in the past 2.1 million years that formed giant calderas, with the most recent caldera-forming event roughly 640,000 years ago. The National Park Service notes that the Yellowstone caldera, created by that major eruption, is roughly 30 by 45 miles later, reshaped as lava flows, filled and modified parts of the collapse. That is why the volcano doesn't resemble a single cone. Its outline is a vast, subtle bowl, easier to sense through its heat and water than through any dramatic peak. Here, geology is a living process. Water sinks into fractures, meets hot rock, builds pressure, and returns to the surface in forms that feel almost theatrical. Geysers, hot springs, mud pots, fumaroles. Yellowstone preserves more than 10,000 hydrothermal features, including more than 500 geysers, an intensity of geothermal activity that turns the landscape into a moving laboratory. Old Faithful, the park's most famous performer, erupts on an average interval of about 90 minutes, with a range that can vary widely, sending boiling water tens of meters into the air. The spectacle is iconic, but the deeper story is what it implies beneath the boardwalks and lodgepole pines. Heat is still being stored, moved, released. And Wyoming doesn't stop at fire underfoot. Travel south from Yellowstone and the landscape shifts again into the sharp relief of Grand Teton National Park, where the Teton Range rises abruptly above Jackson Hole, like a wall pushed straight up from the valley floor. The Tetons are considered one of North America's younger mountain ranges in terms of uplift driven by movement along the Teton Fault system. The National Park Service explains that in roughly the last 10 million years, displacement along the fault is probably over 25,000 feet, an enormous vertical rearrangement that helps explain why the mountains feel so sudden, so uncompromising, so close to the valley. The U.S. Geological Survey also notes that the Teton Fault is still active and capable of producing major earthquakes. In a documentary lens, the Tetons become a reminder that even stable scenery is sometimes just a paused motion. Farther east and North Wyoming offers another kind of geological mystery, Devil's Tower, an isolated monolith that rises out of rolling country like a fossil from a different planet. The National Park Service identifies it as an igneous formation of rare rock faunalite porphyry and calls it the largest example of columnar jointing in the world, those famous vertical polygonal columns born from cooling and contraction. Even the tower's presence tells a longer story. Magma that once cooled below the surface, later exposed by erosion over millions of years. Taken together, these places reveal Wyoming's central theme. The state is not shaped by one single force, but by layers of forces that keep arguing with each other. Uplift versus erosion, heat versus ice water versus stone, stillness versus movement. Yellowstone's caldera is the footprint of collapse after unimaginable eruption. The Tetons are a scar of fault-driven rise. Devil's Tower is a frozen pulse of magma made visible by time. The result is a landscape that feels both ancient and unfinished. So when the wind sweeps across a Wyoming basin and the mountains hold their silence, what is that silence really made of? Empty space? Or deep time still working patiently beneath everything? Wyoming's wildness isn't one habitat. It's a stack of ecosystems stitched together by altitude, temperature, and distance. In the Northwest, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem is often framed as America's last great temperate wilderness, a place where large mammals still move on old instincts and rivers still cut their own arguments through volcanic rock. But Wyoming's biological story doesn't stay inside park boundaries. It spills outward into sagebrush seas, into high basins, into wind-scoured ridge lines, until the state feels less like a postcard and more like a living map of survival strategies. Start in Yellowstone because that's where the land and life feel most theatrically intertwined. The park's geothermal features aren't just geological curiosities, they are biological stages. Thermophiles microorganisms that thrive in heat create vivid mats and color gradients in places that look impossible for life. And above them, the big wildlife story unfolds with a cast that feels almost mythic: bison, elk, wolves, bears, and the long list of smaller species that make the system work when no one is watching. Yellowstone alone hosts 67 mammal species, and the larger Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem supports a grizzly bear population estimated at about 130 as of 2024, a number that hints at both ecological resilience and constant management tension. The most visible symbol is often the bison massive dark and deceptively quiet until they move. In winter, their bodies become weather machines, steam lifting from their backs, snow crust breaking under their weight, hooves punching through drifts like slow percussion. But bison are not alone on these plains. 7 native ungulate species live here: elk, mule, deer, bison, moose, bighorn, sheep, pronghorn, and white-tailed deer, each one tuned to a different version of Wyoming's seasons. And then there are the predators, the animals that don't merely survive the landscape, but reshape it by existing inside it. Wolves are the hinge point in this modern ecological narrative. Gray wolves were restored to Yellowstone in 1995, and NPS notes that as of January 2025, at least 108 live primarily in the park. Their return is widely discussed through the lens of trophic cascades, how an apex predator can influence prey behavior, plant recovery, and the structure of riverbanks over time. Research summaries describe how heavy elk browsing had suppressed young woody plants in parts of the northern range before wolves returned, and how changes after reintroduction have been studied through elk vegetation and habitat patterns. But Wyoming's ecology is bigger than the drama of predators and prey. It is also the quiet architecture of water. Yellowstone's cold water fish, for example, are woven into the park's food web in ways that don't announce themselves until something goes missing. NPS describes cutthroat trout as the most widespread native fish in Yellowstone, and restoration work has focused on keeping native systems intact. And in recent years, the reality of heat and low flows has become harder to ignore. In July 2025, Yellowstone began closing some rivers to fishing to protect fish when water temperatures and conditions became dangerous for cold water species. It's a reminder that in Wyoming, wild doesn't mean unchanging. It often means sensitive. Step beyond Yellowstone, and the palette shifts sometimes abruptly. Western Wyoming's valleys and basins can look empty at first glance, but the emptiness is an illusion created by scale. The sagebrush steppe is its own universe: low aromatic vegetation, wide light, and a sky that makes birds look tiny until they suddenly fill the frame. It's here that one of Wyoming's most astonishing natural events plays out on a schedule older than highways, the pronghorn migration. In the upper Green River Valley and the Red Desert region, researchers have documented pronghorn moving seasonally along corridors that can stretch to Grand Teton National Park. Conservation groups describe the route as roughly 200 miles and call it the longest land migration in the lower 48, a living thread that must pass through bottlenecks, where a single fence-line subdivision or road can become a wall. When pronghorn gather at places like Trappers Point, the scene is less like a herd and more like a decision being made in real time. Do they cross? Do they wait? Do they risk the narrow gap between development and terrain? And if the route breaks, what happens to an animal that has been walking the same story for generations? Wyoming's biodiversity also includes species that don't dominate the headlines, but define the health of the land. The greater sage grouse is one of those symbols and indicator species for the sagebrush ecosystem that supports countless other animals. That's why land use decisions become ecological decisions here. In December 2025, Reuters reported federal rollbacks to sage grouse protections across several western states, including Wyoming, opening more federal lands to energy and mineral development, and removing certain monitoring elements, moves. Critics argue could further stress an already declining species. Even without taking sides, the biological stakes are clear. When habitat fragments, the losses ripple outward, often invisibly at first. What makes Wyoming feel like the edge of the world isn't just the size of its landscapes. It's the way those landscapes still function, like systems, not scenery. In many places across the West, large animal migrations have been shortened, redirected, or erased. In Wyoming, some of them still happen, not because the land is untouched, but because the land still has enough connected space to let instinct remain useful. And that is the tension at the heart of Wyoming's ecology. Wildness here is not a museum exhibit. It's a negotiation between movement and barriers, between old seasonal rhythms and new pressures, between the needs of animals that do not recognize property lines and the realities of human borders. So what does it mean to protect a place like this? Is it about garden, iconic animals, wolves, Bears, bison? Or is it about preserving the less glamorous necessities? Migration corridors, cold water, quiet nesting grounds, the unbroken sagebrush horizon. And if Wyoming's living systems depend on space silence and continuity, how much can be taken before the map still looks wild? But the life inside it starts to thin. Long before Wyoming was Wyoming, long before park lines and highway names, this land already had roots. Roots made of seasons, animals, water, and memory. The National Park Service notes that the human history of the Yellowstone region goes back more than 11,000 years. That number is easy to read and hard to feel until it's imagined as footsteps. Not one group, not one first, but generations moving through mountain passes and river corridors, returning when the weather allowed leaving, when the snow and hunger tightened their grip. In a place like the Greater Yellowstone region, survival was never a single skill. It was a library of skills, reading the sky, hearing the wind change, knowing when rivers would swell, and when they would harden into ice. It meant understanding which valleys held shelter, which slopes carried the first green shoots, which basins offered bison and elk, and which thermal areas were warning signs disguised as beauty. Hot springs and steaming ground could be warmth in a brutal winter, but also danger, a thin crust that could break like glass. And so knowledge here was not abstract. It was physical. It was passed down the way fire is passed down, carefully, deliberately, with consequences if mishandled. When people picture Yellowstone today, they imagine crowds, boardwalks, cameras. But the deeper truth is that this place functioned as a crossroads long before it was a destination. NPS explains that multiple tribes traverse the area, some to hunt, some to travel, some to trade, moving through the park region as part of a larger seasonal rhythm. The Crow generally occupied areas east of the park, the Blackfeet to the north, Shoshone and Bannock and other tribes of the western plateaus traveled through annually to hunt on the plains to the east. This is not a story of a single owner of an empty wilderness. It's a story of a living geography used, known, and remembered in different ways. And the truth gets even more layered when modern connections are acknowledged. The park isn't only tied to the past, it is connected to the present through ongoing tribal relationships. NPS notes that Yellowstone has 27 associated tribes with ancestral and modern connections. That fact changes the emotional framing. This isn't just history. It's continuity. If the land was never silent, why does modern storytelling so often treat it like it was? Outside, Yellowstone, Wyoming carries other indigenous landscapes that don't always make the mainstream highlight reel, but they reveal what sacred geography can look like. Devil's Tower, rising alone from the plains like a stone heartbeat, is one of them. The National Park Service describes it as a place of reverence, with connections that are both ancient and modern. Oral histories and sacred narratives explain not only how the tower was formed in story, but what it means, how a relationship with the natural world is expressed through literal and symbolic language. This matters because Devil's Tower is often introduced to audiences through its Western name, its geology, its silhouette. But its cultural identity is deeper than the outline. NPS notes that many tribes of the Great Plains and Black Hills regions have connections with the area and lists indigenous peoples of the region, including the Arapaho Crow, Cheyenne Shoshone, and Lakota, among others. In the documentary lens, this becomes a moment to slow down, to let the camera linger, not only on the rock, but on the offerings sometimes seen near the base, on the quiet circles of people gathered for ceremony, on the understanding that public land can also be sacred land. Even the name itself carries tension. A National Park Service brochure notes that some Plains Indian tribes have objected to the name Devil's Tower, considering it offensive to a site they regard as sacred, and that changing the monument's name would require congressional action. That single detail opens an entire emotional corridor. Who gets to name a place? And what is lost when a name becomes a stamp instead of a relationship? Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains hold another powerful example, the Medicine Wheel, or Medicine Mountain site. The U.S. Forest Service describes the Medicine Wheel as an active Native American sacred site and notes that interpreters may temporarily close visitation for private ceremonies, an explicit reminder that this is not a ruin. It's a living place. Wyoming history sources also describe it as an important prehistoric archaeological landscape and an ancient spiritual site where ceremonial activity continues. In Wyoming, sacred places aren't always enclosed. Sometimes they're open to wind, to altitude, to tourists, and still expected to remain sacred. That's a fragile arrangement. It requires respect to be more than a word. So, what happens when the modern visitor arrives with a camera, but the land is still in ceremony? The earliest human relationship with this region was shaped by movement, not movement for adventure, but movement for survival. Seasons here are not gentle. They're decisive. Winter can close the high country like a door, while summer briefly opens it like a promise. The people who lived and traveled here learned to follow that rhythm, tracking animals, finding plants at the right moment, moving along rivers and through passes that would later become routes on maps. And because Yellowstone sits on abundant obsidian sources, it also became part of a much larger network of tool-making and trade. The land provided not just food, but materials, sharp volcanic glass that could become a cutting edge, a point, a survival advantage. Even without turning this into an archaeological lecture, the implication lands with weight. This landscape was not merely watched. It was worked with. It was shaped into daily life. In these early stories, the environment is not a villain, but it is never neutral. Food could be plentiful in one season and vanish in the next. A river could feed a camp and then take it away in flood. A herd could sustain a community and then move beyond reach. That uncertainty creates a certain kind of intelligence, adaptive, observant, humble. The successful communities were the ones who could read the world as it was not as they wished it to be. That's also why the idea of Yellowstone as untouched is misleading. When modern people say wilderness, they often mean without humans. But the land does not define wilderness that way. Human presence here, over thousands of years, was often seasonal, mobile, and deliberately light in footprint compared to industrial settlement. But it was still presence, still knowledge, still relationship. NPS's framing of historic tribes and associated tribes is part of correcting that older myth. And then comes the emotional hinge that a documentary can't afford to skip the shift from indigenous relationship to federal preservation. When a national park is created, it protects scenery, but it can also rewrite human history, turning living connections into past tense. Modern scholarship and public history increasingly grapple with how indigenous ties to Yellowstone were minimized or erased in popular narratives, even while those ties persisted. In other words, the story of origins isn't only about how people first arrived. It's also about how later systems decided what counted as legitimate belonging. So here's the question that sits underneath all the beauty. If a place has held human memory for over 11,000 years, what does it mean to visit it for a weekend and leave believing it was empty until someone built a lodge? In Wyoming, history doesn't arrive as a clean timeline. It arrives as overlapping waves, indigenous roots that were already ancient fur trade paths that followed rivers, wagon trails that cut across the plains, and then iron rails that pinned everything down with schedules and stations. The land stayed the same land, but the meaning of distance changed. what once took seasons began to take days. And the moment distance becomes smaller, pressure becomes larger. For much of the 1800s, the story of Wyoming's development can be felt along one repeating corridor, the Platte River system, and the mountain passes that fed it. Fort Laramie began as a fur trade post in 1834, then shifted into a crucial stop for emigrants on the Oregon-California Mormon trails before being purchased by the U.S. Army in 1849 and becoming a major logistics center during the following decades of conflict and expansion. In documentary terms, Fort Laramie becomes more than a building. It becomes a symbol of a turning point when movement across the West stopped being mostly seasonal and indigenous and became organized, militarized, and mass-driven. Then comes the pivot that changes not only Wyoming, but the world's idea of nature protection becomes policy. On March 1, 1872, the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act established Yellowstone as the first national park. In one sense, it was visionary, a radical claim that a landscape could be preserved for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, rather than being fully privatized or mined into fragments. But even that ideal carried a shadow. A park boundary can protect land, yet it can also rewrite belonging, especially when the people in the sentence do not include everyone in the same way. The Yellowstone timeline itself records difficult moments within just a few years. For example, in 1877, the Nez Perce Neme-Poo traveled through Yellowstone while fleeing the U.S. Army. The documentary tone can hold that tension without turning into a lecture. Beauty is preserved, but human history remains complicated. As tourism grew, the park became more reachable, and reachability always changes the kind of visitor a place receives. The NPS Park History PDF notes that the railroad arrived in 1883, making visitor access easier, and that the U.S. Army managed Yellowstone from 1886 to 1918. That detail is important because it reveals what early preservation often required enforcement. The park wasn't simply admired. It was controlled, guarded, and managed because the pressures of hunting, poaching, and profit didn't disappear just because a law was signed. At the same time, outside Yellowstone, Wyoming was being reshaped by something more permanent than wagon ruts rails. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was not simply a transportation project. It was a cultural machine that created towns, jobs markets, and new forms of migration. In Wyoming, the Union Pacific's movement through the southern part of the territory sparked a chain reaction of settlement and infrastructure. The state of Wyoming's official chronology notes that in 1867, Cheyenne was founded and the Union Pacific entered Wyoming. That single year feels like a hinge. The frontier doesn't just get crossed, it starts getting organized. But Wyoming's historical development isn't only a story of men with maps and companies with money. It also contains a quieter revolution, one that complicates the standard Wild West narrative. In 1869, Wyoming's territorial legislature passed a law granting women the right to vote, and it was signed on December 10, 1869. Wyoming history. WyoHistory.org describes that 1869 act as a defining milestone and later details how women participated in juries and civic life soon after. The National Park Service places this in a broader Western context, describing how women in Western territories and states gained voting rights decades before the 19th Amendment. This matters for a Wyoming documentary because it reframes what frontier means. The frontier is often shown as a place of lawlessness, violence, and rugged masculinity. But Wyoming also carried a different identity, one willing, for a mix of political and social reasons, to test equality earlier than most of the country. It's not a simple virtue story. It's a complex human one. But it belongs in the timeline because it tells viewers Wyoming was not just shaped by mountains and geysers, it was shaped by choices. And those choices were always tied to resources. The state's development followed Cycle's fur trade to wagon trails, railroads, to ranching mineral booms to energy. Each cycle brought opportunity, and each one left scars. Towns rose in the places where rails and water met. Work camps appeared, where coal and mineral seams promised quick money. Ranching expanded across grasslands, transforming how land was fenced, grazed, and contested. Even the myth of the cowboy, so central to Wyoming's cultural branding, sits on top of a deeper economic reality: cattle land access, labor, and weather that can break a season in a single storm. In the Northwest, the tourism economy built a different kind of mythology. Geysers bears bison lodgepole forests under sunrise. The park became a story people could buy into first as a journey, then as an image. In the southeast and central corridors, the mythology was movement trains, trails, outposts, and the idea that the West could be conquered by speed. So, the historical development of Wyoming becomes a braided narrative: Yellowstone exploration, documentation, protection, tourism, management, Fort Laramie, and the trails of fur trade post, an immigrant supply hub, a military center during decades of conflict, railroad towns the Iron Line enters, and settlement becomes denser, faster, and more market-driven. Civic identity: a territory grants women suffrage in 1869, creating a legacy that still brands Wyoming as the equality state. But the real documentary question is not what happened. It is what did it cost and what did it create? Because Wyoming's history is full of paradoxes. Yellowstone is protected, yet constantly pressured by the very popularity that protection made possible. Fort Laramie is a landmark of westward migration, yet also tied to the long, painful mechanics of displacement and conflict that followed the military era of the Northern Plains. Railroads made survival easier for some and made land loss extraction and rapid change easier too. Even Wyoming's suffrage milestone is both inspiring and historically specific, born from a complicated mix of idealism, politics, and the realities of a territory trying to define itself. So when the camera pans across a Wyoming horizon, over sagebrush, over rails, toward distant peaks, what is it really seeing? A frontier that ended, or a place where the past is still negotiating with the present line by line, boundary by boundary. Modern Wyoming lives inside a contradiction that grows louder every year. The very landscapes that feel limitless are now being asked to absorb limitless demand. Yellowstone alone recorded 353 recreation visits in 2024, making it one of the busiest years in the park's history. And that's not happening in a vacuum. National Park Service sites across the country logged 358 recreation visits in 2024, a record-level surge that magnifies staffing, maintenance, and safety pressure everywhere. In Yellowstone, crowding isn't just traffic, it's footsteps on fragile ground. The park's thermal basins look solid until they aren't, and the National Park Service warns that more than 20 people have died from burns after entering or falling into hot springs. In 2025, the headlines kept echoing the same lesson. A teen suffered significant burns after stepping through thin thermal crust near the Old Faithful area. Another reminder that in Yellowstone, danger often hides under a surface that looks harmless. Then there's a newer reality that feels almost unsettling. In its symbolism, the geothermal system itself is visibly changing in ways visitors can't control. In late 2025 footage, captured a muddy, dirty eruption at Yellowstone's Black Diamond Pool, and reporting noted that a major event in July 2024 damaged a visitor boardwalk, with rocks and mud flung outward, an incident that pushed the park and scientists to increase monitoring. It's not apocalyptic, but it is clarifying. Wyoming's most famous wonder isn't a museum exhibit. It's a dynamic, pressurized landscape, still active, still unpredictable, still capable of rewriting the visitor experience overnight. Climate pressure enters the story more quietly, then suddenly very practically. In July 2025, Yellowstone announced fishing closures on select rivers, due to warm water temperatures and low flows, specifically to protect native and wild trout fisheries, until conditions improved. It's a small policy notice on paper, but it reveals a much bigger shift. Even iconic places now have to make real-time decisions as heat and water conditions change. In a Wyoming documentary, this becomes a modern tension line, because the park's appeal is built on permanence, yet the management reality is increasingly responsive and fragile. And still, Wyoming's cultural life doesn't disappear beneath the weight of environmental headlines. It adapts. It keeps performing its identity, sometimes proudly, sometimes uneasily, on the edge between tradition and tourism. In Cheyenne, one of the most visible expressions of that identity is Cheyenne Frontier Days, an annual Western celebration that bills itself as the world's largest outdoor rodeo and Western celebration, with roots reaching back more than a century. For visitors, it can feel like a postcard come alive: dust grandstands, rodeo pageantry, country music nights. For locals, it can be something more complicated, a ritual of pride, an economic engine, and a performance of the West that both preserves and simplifies a larger story. In the Jackson Hole region, culture and wildlife collide in a different way through winter. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service notes that elk are typically visible on the National Elk Refuge from mid-December through early April, when deep snow pushes animals to lower elevations and the refuge provides winter habitat. What looks like a serene wildlife scene is also a reminder of how seasonal stress shapes animal behavior, and how humans have inserted management into that cycle. Even local traditions, from sleigh rides to wildlife viewing, exist on the thin line between appreciation and intrusion. And then there's Wyoming's economic reality, another modern contradiction that doesn't always fit the pure wilderness image. The U.S. Energy Information Administration notes that Wyoming's annual coal production declined in 2024 to the lowest level since 1992, as U.S. coal-fired power plants have shut down and other sources increased. Local reporting in late 2025 described coal output projected around 200 million short tons, far below the state's 2008 peak, raising real questions about long-term stability for communities tied to extraction. This matters because Wyoming's identity is often narrated as if it's only about wild space. But many Wyoming towns are also built on work mines, rail lines, drilling fields, wind corridors, hard winters, long commutes. The modern story is not nature versus people. It's people trying to stay rooted while the economy shifts under their feet. While the most famous landscapes in the state experience more visitors, more stress, and more global attention than ever. So, the present-day Wyoming question becomes sharper than any slogan. When millions come seeking silence, who protects the silence? When the ground can burn and the rivers can warm, what does stewardship look like in real time? And when a place is both a myth and a livelihood, who gets to decide which version survives? Wyoming doesn't behave like a place that was made to be finished. It feels like a chapter that's still being written by heat beneath stone, by wind across grass, by migration paths that don't care where the fence lines are. Yellowstone alone holds a volcanic story that reshaped the region in a caldera-forming eruption roughly 640,000 years ago. And even now, the surface keeps hinting at what lies below through more than 10,000 hydrothermal features, where water pressure and rock continue their quiet negotiation. But the modern Wyoming story isn't only geology, it's attention. In 2024, Yellowstone recorded 4,744,353 recreation visits, millions of people arriving to witness something that feels eternal. And that's where the state's most fragile truth shows itself. Beauty here can be unforgiving. Around 20+ people have died after entering or falling into Yellowstone hot springs since the late 1800s. Proof that this landscape isn't just a view, it's an active force. Then there is the part that can't be reduced to scenery at all belonging. Yellowstone has 27 associated tribes with ancestral and modern connections, meaning the land story is also a human story that never truly ended. So, the real question at the edge of the world isn't how wild is Wyoming? It's how responsibly can people meet it? What does it mean to arrive for a single day in a place shaped by deep time, held in living memory, and still capable of changing without permission? If Wyoming teaches anything, it's this: the world doesn't need more visitors who collect landscapes. It needs more travelers who listen, who stay on the path when the ground is thin, who treat sacred places with humility, and who leave no trace, so the next person arrives to the same silence, not a smaller one.